At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, a lookout named Frederick Fleet gripped the crow's nest railing of the RMS Titanic and picked up the telephone handset. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The ocean was so flat and black it looked poured, and directly ahead, barely a quarter-mile out, close enough that the ship's bow wave was already curling against it, sat a wall of ice roughly 60 feet above the waterline and an unknown depth below. Fleet rang the warning bell 3 times and said 6 words: "Iceberg, right ahead." First Officer William Murdoch received the call, ordered hard a starboard, and triggered the emergency stop of the engines. The ship began to turn, and for approximately 37 seconds, it looked like it might work. It didn't. The iceberg scraped along the starboard hull across roughly 300 feet of steel plate, breached 5 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments, and Titanic began taking on water at a rate that the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, calculated would send her to the bottom in under 2.5 hours. He was right to within 20 minutes. 1,117 people died. At the time, that was larger than the entire population of some of the towns those passengers came from. And here's the thing. Here is the genuinely disorienting thing that I cannot stop coming back to. Everything, the regulatory framework governing modern ocean travel, the International Ice Patrol still operating today, the fundamental public psychology about what technology can and cannot promise. Everything was built on the assumption that those 1,517 people were always going to die. The world you inhabit in ways that are hard to fully see until you actually sit with them is downstream of that single 37-second failure. So what happens if it isn't a failure? What happens if Murdoch's hard a starboard turn has 37 more seconds to work? What happens if the iceberg passes 20 feet to starboard, Fleet watches it slide by in the dark, and by the time anyone on deck fully processes what just happened, the Titanic is already cutting through calm, open water again, undamaged, on schedule, arriving in New York Harbor on the morning of April 17, 1912, to the complete indifference of history? Because here is what the research actually shows. The consequences of that scenario are so much larger and so much stranger and so much more personally relevant to the world you live in right now than almost any casual version of this question ever gets around to acknowledging. Start with the ship itself. The Titanic completing her maiden voyage successfully would have been, in the commercial context of 1912, essentially a non-event. That sounds strange to say. This was the largest moving object ever built by human hands. This was a ship that carried a gymnasium, a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, a squash court, and a first-class dining saloon that seated 500 people. But maritime historian John Maxtone Graham, in his authoritative study of the North Atlantic passenger trade, documents precisely how routine maiden voyages of large liners actually were in this period. They were news for approximately 1 day. Then they became ships. The Titanic, in an alternate timeline where she reaches New York, would have begun her second voyage within weeks, settled into a transatlantic schedule, and within a year become simply one of the most luxurious options among a competitive fleet of massive liners operated by competing companies. Think about that. The ship that generated more cultural output than almost any other physical object in the 20th century, novels, films, exhibitions, documentaries, an entire academic subdiscipline of maritime disaster history, would have been, in the timeline where she succeeds, entirely forgotten by 1920. Maybe a photograph in a hotel lobby. That's the first destabilization this question forces on you. The Titanic's cultural immortality is not about what the ship was. It is entirely about what the ship lost. But the regulatory implications are the place where the alternate timeline diverges most sharply from our own, and where the stakes get genuinely enormous. In the immediate aftermath of the actual sinking, 2 parallel inquiries were launched, one by the United States Senate under Senator William Alden Smith, and one by the British Board of Trade under Lord Mersey. Both of these inquiries, using primary testimony from survivors, officers, and White Star Line officials, established findings that maritime historian Stephen Beale, in his 1996 study Down with the Old Canoe, documents as having produced regulatory frameworks that were essentially without precedent in peacetime commercial shipping. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, was adopted in 1914 directly and explicitly in response to the Titanic disaster. It mandated sufficient lifeboat capacity for every person aboard. It mandated lifeboat drills. It mandated 24-hour radio watch. It established the International Ice Patrol, funded jointly by 17 nations, which has monitored iceberg positions in the North Atlantic every single year since 1913, continuously, without interruption, through 2 world wars, and in that time has recorded exactly 0 deaths from icebergs in the patrolled zone. 0 in over 100 years. And I cannot stress this enough. That is not a coincidence. That is the Titanic dead doing work in the world for a century after they stopped being alive. Now remove the disaster. In an alternate timeline where Titanic arrives safely in New York, none of the political pressure that produced SOLAS in 1914 exists. The British Board of Trade inquiry that took place in our world had already, before the Titanic, flagged concerns about lifeboat regulations. The Titanic carried more than the legal requirement under existing rules, which is one of the more quietly monstrous facts in the entire historical record. But regulatory change in maritime law in this period moved slowly without a catastrophic triggering event. Demographic historian Robert Kuby, writing in the Journal of Transport History, has modeled the plausible regulatory timeline for North Atlantic safety law without the Titanic catalyst, and his findings suggest the kind of comprehensive international safety framework that SOLAS represented might have been delayed by 10 to 20 years. Right through the expansion of mass ocean migration, right through the period when transatlantic passenger traffic was at its historical peak. And here's where it gets strange, because the Titanic was not the only ship at risk. It was the one that happened to sink. In an alternate timeline where it doesn't, the ships that were operating in the same regulatory environment, the same inadequate lifeboat requirements, the same absence of 24-hour radio watch mandates, the same absence of coordinated ice monitoring, continue operating. And the question is not whether a disaster happens. The question is when and to whom. Maritime disasters are probabilistic events operating inside regulatory environments. Change the environment and you change the probability distribution. But without SOLAS, you do not eliminate the probability. You defer it and potentially concentrate it. Stay with me because this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because the Titanic's passenger manifest was, in microcosm, a portrait of early 20th century Atlantic migration. 317 passengers on that ship represented first-class plutocrats, second-class middle-class families, and in third class, the largest and most demographically significant group, migrants. Irish migrants, Scandinavian migrants, Eastern European migrants, people moving toward North America in search of lives that the places they came from could no longer offer them. Historian Paul Heyer, in his book Titanic Legacy, documents how the death toll in third class was catastrophically disproportionate. Third-class passengers were 62% of the total aboard, but suffered roughly 75% of the total deaths. Because the ship's geography placed third class farthest from the boat deck, and because no systematic effort was made to ensure their evacuation. That disproportion was documented in the Senate inquiry. It produced outrage. It became one of the specific drivers of the regulatory requirement for drills and evacuation planning that ensured all passengers, not just those whose staterooms were close to the boats, had a survivable pathway. Remove the disaster, and you remove the documented evidence of that disproportion. Remove the documented evidence, and you remove the political pressure to address it. The migrants keep crossing. The regulatory gap persists. If this is already making you rethink everything you assumed about what the Titanic's sinking actually changed, subscribe. because we go this deep every single week. And the next layer of this alternate history is the part that most people never think about at all, because we have been talking about what doesn't happen in the alternate timeline. Now let's talk about what does. What grows in the space where the disaster didn't occur. The White Star Line in our world never recovered. The sinking triggered liability claims, reputational damage, and a restructuring of the competitive landscape of North Atlantic shipping that historian Daniel Allen Butler, in Unsinkable, traces through the full arc of the company's eventual absorption by Cunard in 1934. The Titanic's two sister ships, Olympic and Britannic, sailed in the shadow of the disaster. Britannic was converted to a hospital ship in World War I and sunk by a mine in 1916. Olympic served out her career and was scrapped in 1935. The class was never replicated. In an alternate timeline where Titanic arrives safely, White Star enters the mid-1910s in an entirely different financial and competitive position. The three Olympic-class ships, Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic, which in the alternate timeline is completed on schedule as a commercial vessel rather than being requisitioned as a hospital ship, would have represented the most formidable commercial fleet on the Atlantic. And the competitive dynamics between White Star and Cunard would have played out differently. The Lusitania and Mauretania, which held the blue ribbon for speed, would have been competing against ships that offered a different value proposition, not speed, but scale and luxury. Economic historian Robert Sobel, in his analysis of early transatlantic commercial competition, models the market outcome as a genuine bifurcation. The speed market and the luxury market developing as distinct segments rather than the consolidated, disaster-shadowed single market that emerged after 1912. And this is the part that gets me every single time, because the Lusitania enters this analysis in a way that is genuinely startling. In our timeline, the Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat on May 7, 1915, killing 198 people, including 128 American citizens. The sinking was a significant factor. Historians debate exactly how significant, in the eventual shift of American public opinion toward intervention in World War I. Now, in an alternate timeline where the Titanic disaster never occurs, the regulatory pressure for 24-hour radio watch and improved maritime safety protocols that Solis mandated doesn't exist. But more consequentially, the question of whether White Star's competitive dominance in the luxury segment diverts passenger traffic away from Cunard's faster ships changes the Lusitania's passenger load on that specific May 1915 crossing. Whether it changes it enough to alter the geopolitical significance of her sinking is genuinely uncertain. And I want to be precise here, because the historical record can take us only so far into this chain of contingency. But the point is this: the worlds are not merely different in terms of maritime regulation. They are different in terms of which specific ships were carrying which specific people at which specific moments during one of the most consequential years in the history of the 20th century. Here's the thing about counterfactual history that is easy to miss if you only think about it at the first level. The further from the original divergence point you go, the harder it is to trace specific outcomes, but the easier it is to see the general character of the world that emerges. And the general character of an alternate timeline where Titanic completes her maiden voyage is a world where the dominant narrative about technological progress in the early 20th century is considerably more triumphant and considerably less qualified than the narrative in our own world. Because what the Titanic sinking did, and this is documented in the cultural history of the period with remarkable precision, is interrupt the specific form of technological optimism that characterized the Edwardian Age. Historian Paul Fussell, in his monumental study, The Great War and Modern Memory, traces how the pre-war British and American upper classes inhabited a worldview of almost complete confidence in industrial progress. The Titanic disaster punctured that worldview before the First World War did. In our timeline, by the time the trenches of the Western Front produced their industrial slaughter in 1915 and 1916, Western culture had already absorbed one major lesson about the gap between what technology promises and what it actually delivers. In the alternate timeline, that lesson doesn't land in April 1912. It waits for the war. And the war, without the Titanic, hits a culture that is still largely intact in its Edwardian optimism. The psychological shock is consequently different in character, perhaps more total, perhaps more destabilizing, because there is no prior inoculation. Sociologist Jeffrey Alexander, in his theoretical framework for understanding cultural trauma, has written about how prior experience of catastrophic loss shapes a society's resilience and interpretive frameworks when the next catastrophe arrives. Remove the Titanic, and you remove a specific form of prior cultural processing. The war still comes, but the culture absorbs it differently. And here's where the implications start becoming genuinely personal. Because the cultural processing of trauma in the 1910s and 1920s shaped the specific intellectual and political movements that produced the mid-20th century world. The disillusionment that followed the Great War, combined in our timeline with a pre-existing Titanic-shaped skepticism about unchecked technological confidence, produced a specific form of critical modernism in literature, in architecture, in political philosophy that was simultaneously nostalgic for what was lost and searching for frameworks that might prevent the next catastrophe. Movements, philosophies, regulatory instincts, democratic reforms that emerged in part from a culture that had already been forced to confront the question of who gets into the lifeboats and who doesn't. That question was literally raised by the Titanic. The Senate inquiry heard testimony about class disparities in survival rates that newspapers printed on their front pages. It entered public consciousness as a moral and political problem. In an alternate timeline, it doesn't. Third-class passengers cross the Atlantic in unsafe conditions that nobody has been forced to document and nobody has been shamed into addressing, and the political conversation about who bears the risk of industrial modernity is narrower, more contained, more easily managed by the people who benefit from that containment. Before we close this out, drop a comment and tell me which part of this changed how you think about what the Titanic's sinking actually was. Because I think that's the real question this alternate history forces on us. And this is the part that genuinely unsettles me every time I think about it. We talk about the Titanic as a tragedy. 1,517 people dead, the ship gone, a disaster. And it was all of those things. But the alternate timeline where Titanic arrives safely is not, when you trace it fully, clearly a better world. It is a world with 1,517 more people alive in April 1912. And then it is a world with a specific regulatory vacuum that killed them still intact, operating invisibly, guaranteeing some future version of the disaster at a future unknown date with an unknown passenger list. It is a world where the cultural conversation about who deserves to survive and who gets left on a sinking ship doesn't happen in 1912. It is a world where the Edwardian confidence in industrial progress takes a harder, less mediated blow from the First World War. It might be a world where American intervention in that war takes a slightly different path. It is certainly a world where the International Ice Patrol doesn't exist for the first decade of North Atlantic mass migration. And just to be clear about the timescale here, the period between 1912 and 1930 saw somewhere between 20 and 30 million people cross the Atlantic as passengers on commercial ships. 20 to 30 million people, many of them migrants, operating inside a regulatory environment that in our world had been reformed by the specific and documented findings of the Titanic inquiries, and in the alternate world had not. The difference between those two regulatory environments, measured in human survivability across that volume of traffic, is not a small number. It is not a number that can be estimated with precision. But the direction of the effect is not genuinely ambiguous. The world where Titanic arrives safely has 1,517 more people alive on April 17, 1912, and it almost certainly has more people dead by 1930. That's not a melodramatic claim. That's what unaddressed systemic risk inside a high-volume, high-stakes transportation system actually looks like when it is allowed to operate uninterrupted. And somehow the implications get larger from here, not smaller. Because the Titanic's most durable legacy is not the regulatory framework, though that framework is remarkable. It is not the cultural resonance, though that resonance has proven essentially indestructible across a century of popular culture. It is something quieter and harder to name. It is the specific and repeatable demonstration that human beings in modern industrial systems will, under pressure, make triage decisions about who is worth saving, and that those decisions will, without external accountability, reliably reflect the existing hierarchies of power and class. The Senate inquiry proved it. The survival rate differential between first and third class proved it. The fact that the ship had enough lifeboat space for roughly half its passengers proved it. And here is what the research actually shows, sitting at the end of this particular chain of contingency. The world we live in is not built on the assumption that technological systems are infallible. It is built in part on the documented proof that they fail, and on the specific political and regulatory response to one failure in particular. SOLAS is still the governing international maritime safety framework. The International Ice Patrol is still operating. The principle that you must have enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, which seems so self-evident now that articulating it feels slightly absurd, was not legally required before April 15, 1912. It required 1,117 deaths to become law. That is the world you inhabit. A world where the floor beneath modern transportation safety was built piece by specific piece on the documented evidence of what happens when it doesn't exist. And the alternate timeline, the one where Frederick Fleet's warning and William Murdoch's order and 37 seconds of turning radius somehow conspire to slide the iceberg past in the dark, is not the safer world. It is the world where that floor gets built later or differently or by a different disaster with a different passenger list, in a different political moment, producing a different regulatory framework with different coverage and different gaps. The Titanic didn't sink because the world was careless. The world was careless, and then the Titanic sank, and then the world, partially, slowly, imperfectly, stopped being quite as careless in that particular way. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. It means the 1,917 dead are not simply victims of an accident. They are, in the most precise historical sense of the phrase, the specific people whose deaths produced the specific reforms that made the world measurably less deadly for the millions of people who came after them. Which means the alternate timeline, the one where they live, is also the timeline where they didn't change anything. They crossed the Atlantic. They lived their lives. And the system that killed them in our world kept running, unchanged, until something else gave way. I don't know how to make that feel less heavy than it is. I don't think it should feel less heavy than it is. The contingency of the present is not a comfortable idea. It is the true one. The world you were born into is not the only possible world. It is this one, built on this specific chain of events, these specific deaths, these specific 37 seconds, and almost any of them could have gone differently. They didn't, and here we are.